again. I would like to welcome you to our panel discussion today on the Shanghai Communiqué and 40 years of U.S.-China relations. My name is Karrie Koesel. I'm an assistant professor in the political science department, and I work on contemporary Chinese politics. I would like to welcome especially our friends from China. We have many who are joining us in the audience and our panel today who have come a long way to be with us. As you know, this event is a part of a collaboration between the University of Oregon and the Eugene Opera on the occasion of both the 40th anniversary of the Shanghai Communiqué and the coming performance of the opera Nixon in China, which is coming up this Friday and Sunday at the Holt Center for Performing Arts. And tickets are still available if you're interested. First, I would also like to thank our sponsors for their generous support. This panel is made possible with support from the Office of Academic Affairs, the JSMA, the School of Journalism, the CAPS program, Asian Studies, History, and the UO Confucius Institute for Global China Studies. I would also like to offer special thanks to Cindy Nelson, our organizer extraordinaire, for making all of the events and the arrangements possible, as well as a special thanks to Professor Bryna Goodman for the vision and the excellent collaboration of our series of Nixon in China. So as you know, almost 40 years ago marks a unique moment in history for both the United States and for China. This is the midst of the Cold War politics, the Cultural Revolution in China, and we have a Republican in the White House. 40 years ago marks the resumption and the normalization of relations between the United States and China. And indeed, this is a historic event and no small feat, considering the circumstances. So the topic of our discussion, our roundtable discussion today, is indeed U.S.-China relations, using the Shanghai Communiqué really as a point of departure of looking at current Chinese evaluations and evaluating or predicting the future of our two countries and the relationship between us. I'm delighted to introduce our three distinguished panelists, three men who have really been at the forefront of U.S.-China relations since this historic moment of Nixon and China. However, I would also like to mention that one of our honored guests, Professor William Kirby, unfortunately he's unable to join us due to an illness in his family. However, he does send his deepest regrets and warm wishes for a productive discussion. So first, let me begin by introducing a veteran journalist familiar to many of you in this room, Mr. Robert Keatley. He has served as the editor of 3 newspapers in his extensive journalistic career, including the Wall Street Journal, both in Hong Kong and Brussels, the South China Morning Post, and again the Hong Kong Journal. In addition to reporting on Asia, Robert Keatley has also been a professor of journalism at both Tsinghua University in Beijing and Fudan University in Shanghai. At present, he's a consultant for the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and we are particularly lucky to have him join us today as one of our guests because he made his first trip to China in the spring of 1971 as the first American reporter to receive an individual journalistic visa following the advent of ping-pong diplomacy. He also had the opportunity or the pleasure to interview Premier Zhou Enlai, and he returned the following February to cover the Nixon visit. Our second guest and our second speaker today also comes to us from China, Professor Shen Dingli. We want to welcome you to the University of Oregon, and thank you for making such a long, long journey. Professor Shen is trained both as a political scientist and a physicist, a true Renaissance man. He is currently the executive dean of the Institute of International Studies at Fudan University, as well as the director of the American Studies Center. He is widely published in China as well as abroad, including, I believe, over 500 articles and books.
1,600.
My mistake. 1,600 articles. Very prolific indeed. Wow. On a variety of topics, including nuclear arms control, U.S.-China security relations, disarmament, nuclear proliferation, as well as Chinese foreign policy. And our third guest is Ambassador Robert Platt. Now, many of you heard his very interesting keynote address yesterday evening, reflecting on the Nixon-Kissinger visit. Ambassador Platt served for 34 years as a diplomat, and as a young diplomat accompanied President Nixon on this historic trip to Beijing in 1972. Shortly afterward, he relocated to China in Beijing and was assigned as the chief of the political section of the U.S. Liaison Office. If you're interested in hearing more details about this, we can highly recommend his recent book, China Boys, which reflects on his experiences of working and living in China in these early years. I'd also like to mention that Ambassador Platt was appointed as the ambassador of the Republic of Zambia, the Philippines, as well as Pakistan. And he's been an advocate of something called people-to-people diplomacy, and something I hope he will talk about or touch on in his comments today. So as for the format of our roundtable discussion, each panelist will be reflecting on U.S.-China relations over the past 40 years in about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll have a series of discussions and would like to certainly open it up to the audience to ask your own questions or raise concerns to our distinguished panel. So please join me in welcoming this distinguished panel of gentlemen to the University of Oregon, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Karrie, for that kind and perhaps exaggerated introduction. Because I speak with a little humility here because I'm not a China scholar and I'm not a diplomatic practitioner, unlike the others on the panel. Though I've lived in Hong Kong 3 times and have visited China many times, I've never actually lived there and I don't speak Chinese. But I've tried to write about China and U.S.-China policy over many years, a few decades, in fact, ever since the Cultural Revolution when I lived in Hong Kong and first met Nick Platt, who was then based at the U.S. consulate, part of a wonderful, extraordinary group of sinologists and analysts that the U.S. government was privileged to have then. And I remember various bits of advice and insights that Nick offered then, which proved helpful long after. Hong Kong at that time had its own version of the Cultural Revolution for a while. Students and left-wing labor union members, among others, took to the streets demanding an end to the British imperialism and down with the Queen's own governor. There was occasional violence, including some small bombs that killed a few people in some of the poorer neighborhoods of Hong Kong. It terrified the people. I didn't understand why that was happening. It didn't make sense to me nor to many other people. But it became fairly clear after some months of it that China did not intend to seize Hong Kong and take it over. Zhou Enlai seems to get a lot of credit for that because Hong Kong then was China's main source of foreign exchange and a key conduit for its limited contacts with the rest of the world. China was not a nation that Americans could visit, nor did it welcome tourists or businessmen on any grand scale in those years. So in brief, we were trying to describe a country that we couldn't visit. We could go up to the Hong Kong border, peek across, and see the nearest rice paddies, perhaps, but that was it. And some of us, like me, did it really on a part-time basis because like many other Hong Kong-based journalists, I spent a lot of time in Vietnam and did trips to Indonesia, Thailand, and other places where Washington and others were afraid the Southeast Asian dominoes might or might not fall. But China was obviously of key interest and concern. As this era came to an end, there were various public hints that the fractured U.S.-China relationship would not and could not be permanent. In 1967, as you know, Richard Nixon wrote his famous article in Foreign Affairs, which said improved relations with China were in the U.S. interest and China's interest and the world's interest. In fact, he had told a journalist I knew as far back as 1963, when talking basically about U.S. politics, that he believed a better relationship with China had to come before too much time passed. There were various contacts in Warsaw and elsewhere, but not much of substance seemed to be happening. Nick is much better informed and can describe all that with much more accuracy and detail than I can. But in 1971, as you know, Zhou Enlai invited the U.S. ping pong team, not a very good one by international standards, to visit China for friendly matches after they had appeared in a Tokyo tournament. It was a surprising and brilliant move, and it made very clear that something serious was underway, especially after Premier Zhou met the team when they reached Beijing. All during these years, as I think Nick touched on it yesterday, some of you may have heard, of course, the acute differences between China and the U.S. and the Soviet Union were intensifying. Mao Zedong had his historical, ideological, egotistical, and other reasons for aggravating the Sino-Soviet split, and he did it very effectively. For him, the Soviets were great power revisionists. They betrayed the teachings of Marx and Lenin, and they seemed to want to keep China in a subordinate role. Thus, China befriended any nation that had broken off from Moscow's control. During then, its relations with Yugoslavia were quite good. Marshal Tito then had one nation which covered most of the Balkans. He'd slipped away from Moscow control and got away with it. Romania under Ceausescu was another special friend. I was in Nixon the year before, in China the year before the Nixon visit, when Ceausescu visited, and he got a tumultuous welcome, quite unlike the one Richard Nixon got. I'll come to that later. And there were many editorials in Chinese in what was then called the Peking Review, describing the peoples of China and Albania are 701 million people combined to fight revisionist, imperialists, and all evil forces. You can guess which country had the 1 million. That division, as others have explained much more fully, was one of the major reasons 40 years ago that Richard Nixon was able to visit China, and why the Shanghai Communiqué, that this conference is all about, came into being. Mao thought rightly that improved links to the U.S. would upset the Soviets and decrease the chances of real war with China, that China could not win, despite his brave talk about rifle and millets and the vast Chinese population. It would worry Moscow, and it would give him in the U.S. a good ally. And of course, Nixon and Kissinger saw the opening as an effective tool for bringing the Soviets into a more stable and less dangerous relationship under the policy known as détente. I remember a couple small examples. In '71, I was in Shenyang, up in the northeast, and there were a lot of posters and skits and whatever about China's three enemies. One, of course, were American imperialists in Vietnam. Little children would do song and dance routines about bayoneting Americans in Vietnam, kill, kill, kill. But it was all kind of jolly, if you can imagine. There didn't seem to be a lot of emotion in it, or when you talk to other people about the American relationship. The Japanese aggressors were other foes, and that meant something. There was a deep, to me it seemed a deep emotional reaction from people. They had a collective memory about what had happened in China, and particularly in that part of China, and it meant something. But there was also the polar bear. There were huge posters in that part. Polar, mean, vicious-looking polar bears coming across the ice, headed for China. And people were supposed to do something, it wasn't clear to me what, but beware of them and don't let them do something unwanted to China. Also, little later years, I was up on the Usuli River near a little town called Hulin, close to an island which the Russians called Damansky, because they occupied it, and the Chinese called Zhenbao. It was a kind of worthless little piece of property tucked up close to the Chinese side. It looked like any rational person would have given it to China and let it go at that. It really had, it was a piece of useless floodplain, but it had troops on it, Soviet troops. In '69, the PLA invaded, drove the Russians away. They came back in force, retook it. 2 weeks later, a much larger Chinese force took it, and they've had it ever since. They now legally have it due to a border settlement. But some people, and certainly Russian analysts, thought this was one of the things that Mao did deliberately to aggravate the relationship and make something like the Nixon visit possible. I can't speak to that, but to the Russians whose works I've read, they thought the meeting was perhaps going to happen sooner, but some internal Chinese political things caused a delay, and it didn't happen until 71. Anyway, the ping pong team came. I was not on that delegation, but it did cause me to try again for a Chinese visa, which I eventually got through the embassy in Ottawa. Ambassador Wang Hua gave it to me, and a man who was later foreign minister and interlocutor for Henry Kissinger in the very early days when he was later in New York. Wang Hua was at the UN. So off to China for 6 weeks. China of those days was still deeply immersed in the Cultural Revolution. The violence, which was horrific, was pretty much over. The army had been sent in. PLA was present every place we went, and things were calm. And to the best of my knowledge, they remained calm from then forward. But it was red badges, red book, what we called the Mao suits, and a kind of uniformity. We took, as Nick showed you in his film yesterday, we entered China at Lo Wu. You walk across the bridge carrying your suitcases, go into the train station, wait for the Guangzhou or Canton Express, and flew from there to Beijing. The first flight, I'm paraphrasing here, the stewardess said something like, fasten your seatbelts, put out cigarettes. People smoked in airplanes then. Take out your little red books, turn to page 44, and we will now read. Everybody in the airplane took out a little red book. They all turned to the same page, and they followed along in this little prayer meeting. And that was the tone of many places that we went to in those years. Nothing like that, of course, exists today. We visited many communes and factories. There were always members of a revolutionary committee which ran it. We met a vice chairman at every place. I was never certain that a chairman existed. We would hear how the thoughts of Chairman Mao inspired everyone to work harder and better. There would be the chairman's photos and sayings posted out in the rice fields to inspire the rice, if not the workers. And it was omnipresent. And people talked to us at that time pretty much in slogans. And you didn't have personal contact. It really wasn't advised. It wasn't condoned. We really didn't. We had minders. Mine was very ideological because his neck was on the line. If people like me did something unseemly and bad, it would reflect on him and not to his career advantage. I mentioned the Ceausescu visit. When he arrived, the Chinese turned out, I think it's fair to say, about 1 million people to greet him. They lined the road from the airport all the way into Beijing, into Tiananmen Square, 4 or 5 deep on each side of the road. There were dancers, musicians, ethnic groups in colorful costumes, singers, endless, all cheering, waving for the great man, who, of course, was one of history's nastier pieces of work, who was there to celebrate Sino-Romanian friendship. The ceremonies that I got to attend included a Sino-Romanian friendship rally with a gang of 4. Was up on the stage. Ceausescu and Zhou Enlai spoke. Mrs. Lin Biao was there, but Marshal Lin Biao was not. I believe she was trying to establish a political presence for herself in those years. A couple of banquets at the Great Hall. It was a very important signal aimed at Russia and helping perhaps clear the way for another relationship with the U.S. Romania at times, of course, was a conduit for the U.S. in trying to deal with China. The trip included a visit to Yunnan, where Chairman Mao had lived in these caves, which are cut into the loess soil. They're really rather nice. If you want to, they're not. It's not an image of living in a dark, dingy cave. But again, the propaganda of the day was a dominant theme. We were shown the chairman's cave, and there was one right next to it. And we asked, well, who lived there in those days? This was at the end of the Great Long March, early 40s, perhaps. And we were told, well, it was his secretary, his personal assistant. One of the people present had a guidebook published in Beijing the year before the Cultural Revolution, showed these pictures, and it labeled this cave as belonging to Liu Shaoqi, who was the president of China, whom Mao had driven from office and eventually to his death. Foreign propaganda, said our guide. It couldn't possibly be true, but it was a book published in Beijing by the official press. I spent a rather long, tedious afternoon in the Linbiao Museum, which I'm sure closed for repairs not long after. Linbiao was a marshal who was designated, in most people's eyes, as the heir apparent. He later fled with his family a few months after this case toward Moscow, apparently, and crashed in Mongolia and was killed. They were all killed. I asked why there weren't any pictures of anyone else in this museum. There was no. Why wasn't Judah, who had been the actual commander of the military in those days? He said, well, this is a museum dedicated to Lin Biao, and you just weren't supposed to talk about anybody else. One of the most interesting exhibits there, though, was Chairman Mao's stuffed horse, which was in a glass cage. And I had visions of the chairman riding across the desert like the Lone Ranger, hi-yo, red flag away, or something of the sort. And I asked, well, what's the name of the horse? And they said, it didn't have a name, it's just a horse. But just repeating, we had these endless recitations about the chairman's thoughts, and not a lot of substance, but what you could see was interesting. We visited various communes that had differing degrees of comfort, apparently. In some places we went were very tense. There had been disputes, faction fighting, recent time in one. They did concede that, but didn't say how. And the army was keeping a firm grip. Another one nearby was very relaxed. The people seemed to get along. It was very productive. So we got a sense that nothing was quite uniform as we went around China. The visiting included a meeting with Zhou Enlai. It wasn't exactly an interview. By that time, there were 3 American couples and 3 men and our wives who were associated with newspapers. We were invited to dinner in the Great Hall of the People. They pointed out, not by accident, that we were meeting in the Taiwan room, the small signal. And there were no great messages sent, I'm afraid. There was a lot of talk about China's problems, but not a lot of detail. A little too much talk, with hindsight, about the United States. But I think the fact that the meeting took place was the main message. It was another small sign that something was underway between the U.S. and China. There was a little item in the People's Daily about it the next day. There were broadcasts on Chinese radio, which people picked up. Some people I met later in life heard them and reminded me of it. As we came to an end, I do remember asking the Premier, would it be possible for an emissary for President Nixon to come to China to visit? And the only answer it could get was sort of an enigmatic, well, he knows what he would have to do. I'm not quite sure what that meant, but it didn't go beyond that. But as I say, the event itself was the message. I came back on the Nixon trip. If you see the opera, which is fascinating opera, at one point the president sings about the glories of prime time. And this trip, from a journalist's point of view, was really about television, transmitting wonderful pictures of different Chinese events, scenes, sometimes perhaps a little staged, back for an American audience, and to reflect glory on the president, as well as, of course, help sell the whole idea of a relationship with China. No one is quite sure how it was going to develop. No one is quite sure how it would go down politically in the U.S. And I learned that it was really about television as soon as we landed in Shanghai for refueling and to pick up a Chinese pilot or navigator for the onward trip to Beijing. We went into the terminal, and I saw two spokesmen from the foreign ministry whom I had met before, the year before, in China, and they came up and greeted me as an old friend, and I thought, well, maybe I can have a chance to organize some interviews or do a little traveling or something with their help. Sorry. I'm just going to turn that. Turn that off. And they were very friendly. And then one of them said, "Do you know Harry Reasoner, John Chancellor, and Walter Cronkite, who were the three anchormen of news in those days?" Some of you may not remember that far back. And I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Could you introduce us?" And so I took him across to where Harry and John, others were talking, introduced him. But last I saw of him, they and most others like them attached themselves, or were attached to help television. And the people who carried a kind of technology we called portable typewriters in those days. I'm not sure that all of you know what those are. Were relegated to being bussed and briefed and moved around from here to there without a great deal of substance and without access to, of course, and not surprisingly, to any Chinese officials who might be able to give a little background and explanation about why this was taking place, and frankly didn't expect it in China, though it's kind of thing is quite common in other countries. But one of the concerns of the White House was how the conservative part of the U.S. population would take this trip. One day we went to Beijing University and had a briefing from the vice chairman of the Revolutionary Council, a distinguished, kindly gentleman named Zhou Peiyuan, a distinguished physicist, PhD from the University of Chicago, who sat there and went on at great length, as he had to do, about how the chairman's thoughts had improved the quality of education in China. You knew he didn't believe one word of what he said. We didn't know that higher education was really shut down for 10 years, that nothing much was going on. And as we got on the buses to come back, by chance, I happened to be sitting next to William Buckley, whom I did not know, and I didn't meet then either. He was founder and editor of National Review, a leading conservative publication, marvelous speaker, articulate. sitting there grinding his teeth, muttering about the damn commies. What are we doing here? Just furious that this thing was taking place and he was there. And we've been given a little gift, a little box with a cloisonné vase in it at this stop. And he carefully put it under the seat and left it when we got on the bus because he was not going to take a gift from the but as you know, the trip went down superbly politically in the States. I'm going to skip traveling with Kissinger in general. In later years, I was asked to say something about it, but if anyone's curious, they can ask. Just close a little thoughts about relations with China as I see them. A sinologist at UC San Diego named Susan Shirk wrote a book a few years ago called China, Fragile Superpower. And I like the title because if you look at China, which of those two words do you emphasize? Do you see a superpower or do you see fragility? I tend to be slightly on the fragility side. I think China is a nation with enormous problems. I wouldn't try to list them all here, but I think Americans don't fully understand some of them are. Their demographics. The population is going to start to decline in 20 years or so, thanks to the one-child policy. But what is really happening is that it's aging. They're going to have perhaps workforce problems in future years. There's some signs of that already, I believe. There is a male-female ratio that is almost a guarantee of social unrest. In normal populations, normal birth rates, there are 104, I think, 2 men to 100 women. In China now, it's something like 118 to 100, thanks to abortions. There is also the 1-2-4 problem, which Chinese talk about a lot. One worker supporting 2 parents, supporting 4 grandparents sometime down the road in future years. They don't have a social welfare net, safety net, the means to take care of that yet. Doing it is extremely difficult, extremely expensive. I don't know how that will be handled. There's an enormous water problem, along with all the other environmental issues. 60 or 70% of the water in China, I'm told, is unfit for human use, any kind of human use. Some of it is dangerous to touch. They're now piping, they have 3 huge projects piping Yangtze River water north to Beijing and elsewhere. But you may just relieve one problem there and create new ones in the south where you've taken the water from. The economy is unbalanced. Too much investment, not enough consumption. This nation's economy, as you know, is something like 70% consumer society. China, the consumption rate was about 45% when they announced they would shift more to consumerism. It then dropped to 35%, went the opposite way. I think it's being corrected, or it's moving back a bit, but there is a long, long way to go to get a sustainable economic growth that doesn't rely on exports at a time when export markets are becoming more difficult, or upon a real estate construction, the real estate bubble. It can't be mine, no. I know that to try to promote consumerism, one thing the Bank of China is now considering is introducing prepaid credit cards, the kinds that you might buy at Walmart here or at Safeway or whatever, which might not be a bad idea. You can't go in debt because they're only worth what you put on them up front, but it might encourage people to spend more money and not save it. The Chinese saving rate is too high. there is a certain amount of distrust on both sides about the future. Nick is very sanguine about that. I'm not entirely as much at ease because the experts don't necessarily make policy. What you hear from Republican candidates now about China may disappear when and if one of them becomes president, as has often happened in the past. But there is an attitude that we need to do something in the economic field to restore more of a balance to our relationship. Secretary Clinton has talked about the military buildup and the need for better communications to reassure both sides about what each other is up to. But at the bottom line, I agree entirely with what Nick says, that this is a complicated, essential, unavoidable, contradictory, and many other adjectives kind of relationship. Both countries need it. Neither one can get away with it. And by and large, what we need is more of it, everything across the board. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to turn to our next speaker, Professor Shen.
Thank you very much, Chair. Let me first thank my inviter, Professor Goodman, to bring me here to this audience. I feel humbled to speak with Ambassador Platt and Mr. Keatley. They have made history, and they met Chang and his colleagues, who are still my hero and a role model. I also am glad to meet with Dr. Dailan, the co-director of the Confucius Institute at the university. Well, given 15-20 minutes, I would say that we all benefited from the history making 40 years ago. Nick was a part of the U.S. Team to make me and my wife, who is sitting in the audience, to live a peaceful life today. Sometimes I reflect, if it were not for the Nixon visit, certainly history would be different and our life would be different. But I still believe it would move forward, but with less momentum, less peace and prosperity as we enjoy today. 40 years ago, out of strategic consideration, China could not handle both the U.S. and the Soviet Union. We made two enemies. Mao Zedong and the Communist Party used to claim that the U.S. is a democratic power that we should model after. In his speech in mid and the late 1940s, he considered that U.S. should be a country that we should model after. When he received U.S. diplomats, they came to Yan'an to reconcile the relationship between KMT and the Communist Party. He told them, and these were declassified by U.S. State Department's archive, that once we won, Communist Party would take over power. We would model after Dr. Sun Yat-sen's Sanminzui, for the people, of the people, by the people. Model after President Roosevelt's liberalism, and to make a new China, which has its central government and local government all would be accountable. He has a great idea how we should learn the modality and the experience of America. And he also stated that once we make a new China, we shall modernize the country to turn agricultural country to an industrialized country. And we should open up, we should do international cooperation in order to modernize a poor China. And primarily we should collaborate with the US. He did not say collaborate with Stalin, Soviet Union. Of course we should collaborate with every country who would treat China equally, but he mentioned America. But he missed the opportunity. He missed. Because US, despite his efforts, the US sent diplomats to China to reconcile the opposing parties. US still bet for the KMT and send military technology, weaponry, munition to the KMT to beat communists, and the US failed. Mao Zedong did not trust the US, even though he liked it. And Mao Zedong need security, so he rushed to Russia, Soviet Union, and he made an alliance in February 1950. A decision out of our fear of lack of security. That made us to pay a dear cost, the Korean War. 4 months, we made a treaty. 4 months later, North Korea launched the warfare. They richly deserve unification. But to impose a warfare upon others with military confrontation is certainly controversial, and it cost North Korea dearly. And because we were an ally of Soviet Union, and we were a part of the communist camp, it's very hard for us to avoid. So we want to be friendly with America, and America has shown its friendliness to China. In January 1950, U.S. government made it clear that the U.S. security commitment to Far East would not include the Republic of China and Republic of Korea. But we missed opportunity. China want to be friendly with the U.S., and the U.S. want to be friendly. But U.S. supported Chiang Kai-shek to bomb Shanghai, and the U.S. mistakenly bombed Manchuria, the northeast part of China, when it supported its ally. It's a virtual ally. They made ally later. U.S. Defeated North Koreans' military action, but U.S. made a mistake, and China urged the U.S. to stop its mistake, and the U.S. did not follow. Therefore, we entered a war that cost U.S. 50,000 plus lives, and China 3 more times a casualty. So we missed the opportunity. And then we entered the Vietnam War, and we thought it's our turf. And we have an obligation to aid our neighbor who want to earn their unification. All Vietnamese would live under one roof that they richly deserve. But again, North Vietnamese Viet Cong used military means to work on it, and China supported. And that's something the U.S. could not accept, given the 1954 Geneva Agreement that officially and legally divided the two Vietnam. So we want to bring peace, prosperity, and harmony and unity to our friend. And the U.S. cannot let its friend to be inflicted with arms. Therefore, China-U.S. had a difficulty. And the rise of Soviet Union posed security challenge to both China and U.S. It's for this China could not handle both Soviets' threat and the U.S. threat. So China turned to U.S., taking opportunity of the ping-pong diplomacy. And the U.S. felt that China, even though China posed a threat to Chinese communism, U.S. is feeling more threat from Soviets. U.S. has difficulty in handling both. Therefore, we presented our pragmatism. We are not ideologically opined to collaborate, but we care our security, and we'll work together. Dr. Henry Kissinger came to China in 1971. preparing for his president's visit next year. And actually, so 40 years ago, President Nixon came to China, and 10 years ago, another Republican president, George W. Bush, came to China on the day when Shanghai Communiqué was made. He came on February 28th, 2001. Then 40 years later, what do we see? China hugely benefit from its rapprochement with the U.S. We became more secure. And I still vividly remember that when I was at a class, our teacher told us, and we felt shocked, that actually our government spent lots of effort to educate people that we are going to host President Nixon. Many people would have difficulty. They cannot accept that we should welcome President Nixon because he is the head of an imperialist country. And they still support Taiwan to make China unable to unify. So my teacher told me that we should have a policy. You don't go to outside to avoid to meet with them. In case they will be in Shanghai, they move around and they have the entourage, you have the journalist corps. So you don't have a chance to meet with them. But in case you meet with them, or they came to our class, how we should behave. Neither too humble nor too aggressive, to be too aggressive. So we should have a dignity, but we should also treat our guests with friendship. So as young, I was 11 years old at that time. I felt first shocked. Imperialists came to China. Second, we are now safe because America is so powerful. America is a superpower. Now we have a new friend. America is our newly found friend, a superpower that work with us. On the one hand, they would still be harmful to us. On the other hand, we would become friends. So that's a kind of good feel. I think that has been there for the next 40 years. Today, China benefit. We need to deploy less use of resource, and to handle Taiwan, to handle threat from southeast. We can deploy our force to handle the we call Soviet Union as a bear, Beijing, North Polar bear, and we can more exclusively handle them. So become more secure. And the U.S. gave not only a weapon not only to Taiwan, but also to mainland China. We are opposed to U.S. providing weapon continuously to Taiwan, but we enjoy the U.S. weapon provision to us. Many people fail to understand that we used to accept the weapon from the U.S. in 1980s. U.S. provided us with Black Hawk helicopter, which we still use. A few years ago, when we were hit by a huge earthquake in part of Sichuan, and we used the helicopter. And we asked the U.S. to provide with us some spare parts. U.S. refused because of the arms embargo imposed in 1989. So security-wide, we benefit. But the benefit is not one way. U.S. also benefit. U.S. enjoy that China attracts lots of Soviet troops in Far East. In China-Mongolia border, the Soviet need to deploy lots of force to handle China. That reduces security pressure America and its NATO ally would feel in Central and East Europe. So we also improve security that America would enjoy. 40 years ago, primarily it's the security. And now it has been so expensive, so deep, so strong, and you name everything. When I come to U.S. in 1989, enjoying an IRE, Institute of International Education, which is just across the UN headquarters in New York City. I got a fellowship from there, so I went to Princeton to do my postdoc for 2 years, 89 to 91. My wife went to U.S. Receiving her higher education, eventually getting a PhD from USC. We came to U.S. on the U.S. U.S. provided money to us, for which we are eternally grateful. Now, Chinese government has set up CSC, China Scholarship Council. So my PhD student can apply to Chinese government Ministry of Education administered CSC to ask for money. So our professor would evaluate anonymously their academic performance, and they may get a grant from Chinese side and go to U.S. if a certain professor in a U.S. university would host them. So the tide has changed. It's more two-way rather than one-way. And I'm also happy to see the creation of Confucius Institution in the U.S. and abroad. And China brings the teaching resource, friendship, and delivery of our culture to U.S. campus, to American people, if they would like to host. Some of them may be less welcome our effort, but more and more welcome us. So we are sending our education and to spread our culture in a nice way to our friends. So this is a big change. President Obama came to China in November 2009, which is 30 years after the establishment of the official relationship between the country, and which was 7 years after President Nixon's visit. So President Obama and the President of China, the Honorable Hu Jintao, announced that 4 years from that time, actually 3 years already nearly passed, the two countries would send more and more students to the other side. Chinese side would send 10,000 PhD students sponsored by Chinese government to the U.S. And the U.S. would send 100,000 strong American students, mostly undergraduate, to China. And the U.S. would manage to spend U.S. money to send them. So it's a 10 versus 1. But of course, at this time, Chinese students may have some 200,000 Chinese students studying in the U.S. at this time. And the U.S. is enjoying, has sent 13,000 American students to China to study at this particular time. So U.S. has not met its target. But China has sent lots of students. But President Hu Jintao mentioned we would send 10,000 PhD students. So it's a big effort. Much has been strengthened. In 1979, Mr. Deng Xiaoping asked your president, Jimmy Carter, could we possibly send some students to America? Then President Carter asked him, how many? I picked the story. Mr. Deng Xiaoping said, probably thousands. Then President Carter said, tens of thousands will be okay. Now, hundreds of thousands. So if someone would have an expertise of Chinese language and understanding Chinese culture and how they would speak, how they would think, if you don't like it, what they think, but they can predict what they would behave, that would help the U.S. if they join the government. When they negotiate with China, they would know how China would they can predict how China would act. If they do business, they would make more fortune. So it will be good, nice to mutually understand and learn. Secretary of Treasury of the U.S. Used to study at Peking University. So in 2009, he went to Peking University to speak, and he said, let's learn each other, 相互学习, 相互帮助, help each other. So let me say, in the last 40 years, given the new strategic landscape, America is now our friend, quasi-ally. We have not signed the treaty, but we know we have a common enemy until 1989. So China has much improved its international environment to get investment from U.S., to have more relaxed mood, to open mind domestically to allow market economy, and also to be ready for more domestic reform, which make Chinese people to unleash their productivity. And eventually, U.S. Has bought last year 320 billion US dollar equivalent of Chinese good, which is a big help to China to make Chinese government to enjoy domestic stability. So people would have a job because you buy stuff from us. And we do not send armed force to coerce the U.S. to buy. Of course, some American people would say we manipulate the currency to attract American to buy, which is controversial. I can neither deny we have manipulated or to confirm we have. But American people, out of their own interest, they bought, and China has bought 120 billion US dollar for the first time, more than 100 billion. So China-US two-way trade has accounted for nearly for 25% of China's total trade. U.S. has become an indispensable economic ally of China. You make China rich, prosperous, making us to live better life. And Chinese government, from its heart, is grateful to America. So we want any U.S. leader who would support the current policy to build a stable and strong China-U.S. economic bond. Meantime, China is offering more and more opportunity to America as well. China burns to save your environment. We export probably with some discount, with some subsidy, etc. But that saves the U.S. money to stabilize your domestic market, to make your inflation low. It may be a little more unfair, but people can still accept this. But China need to catch up to fully employ a market economy system. Therefore, China would be fully on a par with the U.S. to raise its economic productivity and to have fair economic partnership with America. China has been improving, giving the U.S. assistance and help, but China needs more time. Just like North Korea wouldn't need 20, 30, 40 years to transform, and they are showing some chance to open. So Nixon visit to make China able to open. So Mao Zedong eventually is doing what he wanted to do in 1940s. He has not done enough, and then Deng Xiaoping continued to do. Deng Xiaoping had not done enough, and we want Hu Jintao and his successor, possibly Xi Jinping, to do. Our previous president, Jiang Zemin, called my mentor, President Xie Shizhe, who got a PhD from MIT in physics. Could you write a letter of recommendation to let my son to study in the U.S.? She did. And President's son went to Drexel University to get a PhD. He would return to advise his dad what is the U.S., how he personally would perceive the U.S. after spending a few years in the U.S. And now the daughter of Vice President Xi Jinping is studying at Harvard. I think she will return to advise the future president of China how America would perceive us, how we would deal with America in a mutually respectable way. So in many ways, China took U.S. as a reference. That it's a mountain. We have a climbing. We think this is a beacon that we have to catch. But it may also be a beacon that we can be on our par. America may have concern that how China can surpass us. On per capita level, China would never be able to do it. But on an aggregated scale, China could do it in the next 10, 20 years. I'm confident that we can do, as we would collaborate with America, and as long as we collaborate, we have more people we will do. So our two countries would have continuously to deepen our already strong relationship to make it more substantial. But meantime, America would be concerned that China would be another a bigger power, if not a superpower. America would be difficult to accept another superpower, especially it would be another hegemonic superpower. And for this, our two countries are developing more competition, more concern that need us to understand and to provide a remedy. So today I'm presenting all these sources. I use more time than I should, to tell you that Fudan University is leading our country in providing liberal arts education, and to educate our students that we should respect America as a beacon. And we should fulfill Mao Zedong's dreams that we should do, bring China power through democracy and science, and let people to enjoy all this kind of a great dream. And we have a distance to it. So generations and generations of us would aspire to eventually to fulfill the dream. And Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and we would, and our future generation would live a far better life. At that time, we will not forget that President Nixon came to China, and Nick Pratt was a part of the entourage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Shen. And our last speaker, Ambassador Nicholas Platt.
Well, I'm delighted to be back in this room. I bent your ear for a long time last night. I'm going to try to be briefer this time and a little more focused. Our two speakers represent important facets of the U.S.-China relationship. And I think that Bob Keatley gave you a very good sense of the strategic reasons for Nixon coming to China and for Mao wanting Nixon to come to China. And that was the original rationale. And Shen Dingli has given you a good feel for the people-to-people element, the growth of the personal relationships between Americans and Chinese that have happened as a result of the Nixon opening. And so there are these two elements which have been documented and talked about at great length. Summing up the strategic side, I think that the opening to China really was the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union, because it gave us a chance to concentrate on the Soviet Union. We didn't have to have, we weren't concerned about a two-front contest with the communist world. Ever since the Japanese had invaded Manchuria in the 30s, the United States had always had to pick and choose between China and Japan as to who was going to be their enemy. Now we didn't have to anymore because we could have a constructive relationship with both. It took something like 15, 18 years for the Soviet Union to collapse. But the relationship, the downward slide, the strain on the Soviet Union really began at the time of the Nixon visit. And as a result of it, the people-to-people aspect started in the year after when this liaison office opened, and that's opened the channels for trade and investment and for students and academic exchange, scientific exchange, legal, education, all of the things that go to make up what is now really the biggest bilateral relationship that we have. The GDP of the United States and China combined now account for 1/3 of the world's total GDP. The trade between the two countries now accounts for about 1/5 of the total of the world's trade. So this is a gigantic relationship, and it's not happened as a result of the decisions of two important political figures. Mao and Nixon made it happen, but what has resulted from their initial decision is really a people-to-people phenomenon. I said last night that the original relationship looked like a single tactical field telephone with Henry Kissinger cranking at one end and Zhou Enlai saying "way" at the other. And that was true. But now it's a huge fiber optic cable with millions of messages going back and forth every day. And the governments don't see most of them. The momentum of the relationship is a product of the decisions of millions and millions of people who are actively engaged in China trade and investment, whether they be soybean farmers or the pig farmers that Xi Jinping visited, the people who put together the Apple at Foxconn, and you can name a whole raft of different decisions, whether or not to broadcast the NBA games of Jeremy Lin. These are all, the stuff of our day-to-day relationship, and they're basically made by people who are not high government officials. There's an argument about what's going to happen, and the drift towards confrontation is a very common phrase now in the media and amongst the intellectual community. It's sort of the angst of the month, and I think that we have to address it. My own feeling is that we're so intertwined that confrontation is simply not an option. But people will argue with me, and I will happily return fire. I think looking ahead, we have to take into account two major challenges. One is internal, and one is external. The key word for the internal challenge is rebalancing. And both Bob and Dingli talked about imbalances in the economic situation, and in China saving too much and consuming too little, and investing too much in real estate, and a whole range of distortions that have occurred as a result of the policies of recent years and the developments of recent years. And they're having an impact on China's society. There's a bigger gap than ever before between rich and poor. There's a severe corruption. There's there's inflation as a result of a whole range of different pressures. All of these need to be confronted. The World Bank has just issued a big report about China in 2030, which says that China cannot continue to sustain its growth unless it is able to liberalize its economy and to give a better emphasis and more attention to the private sector and to the service sector, and build up the internal regions of the country. And there are obstacles to that. There are special interests who would stand in the way of that. Banks and exporters and construction companies and so on and so forth. But that's the challenge that faces the new leadership in China. And of course it has whether they succeed or not, has a big impact on our relationship and on our ability to put our fiscal house in order, given the interdependence of the two economies. We have a fiscal problem, we have a debt problem, we have a jobs problem. All of this depends on us facing up to them, but also will be affected by how well China is able to rebalance. Our imbalances are almost a mirror image of China's. We save too little and spend too much and don't spend enough on infrastructure. I could go down the list. But if we can succeed in rebalancing the way our economies work together, we'll have a much more stable rest of the century, let me put it that way. And of course, China's problems, whether they be shortage of water or the banking, their own bank reforms, they are all providing opportunities for Americans to help and to invest. The Chinese need a new safety net or a bigger safety net for their people. And American insurance companies and others are happily providing advice and hopefully providing investment opportunities in the future. So the relationship between us and both of our problems offer opportunities to both sides. One of the new trends in our relationship is the arrival of Chinese equity investors in the United States. Rather than just put everything into U.S. treasuries and so forth, people in China want to diversify their portfolios, and they want to buy into American companies and make investments here. The amount is very small right now, but it's growing exponentially. 3 years ago was about $1 billion. 2 years ago was about $5 billion. Last year was about $15 billion. It's going to go up and up and up, and it's something that we should welcome. There is some resistance to it, but certainly not amongst farmers, not amongst construction people, not amongst people who are drilling shale oil and so on and so forth, where some Chinese companies are putting their money. Chinese equity, Chinese investment in the American economy is something we should welcome, and I think over the next 20 years or so, the two countries will become the largest investors in each other. So the internal challenge is rebalancing, and it's of course external in the sense that it's mutual and mutually interdependent. But by the major external challenge, I want to identify one which has not been mentioned so far, and which is going to be, in my view, the big issue that will not only plague us, but also can be a force to bring us together. And that is climate change. People don't want to talk about climate change, but the evidence of it is all around us. The drought in our southwest is a result of desertification, a result of climate change. The Chinese are going through the same process in their equivalent of the southwest. The amount of arable land that is devoted to growing food has shrunk, partly because people are growing biofuels and things like that. But there is a shortage of food, which has been identified by the World Bank as a coming crisis, which is not cyclical, but is something that is developing in a straight line. Water is a huge problem. China has, of course, is continuing to develop its economy and continuing to develop its cities. Now, for the first time this year, 50% of China's people live in cities. When I went to China with Nixon, it was 20% who lived in cities. And China was 80% rural. This extraordinary building boom that has occurred has completely changed the nature of the Chinese economy and has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's also created its own set of problems. But one of them, of course, is that the water table goes down by feet a year in major parts of China, and environmental issues like air pollution and so forth are putting at risk the most basic elements of life, water and air. We have to deal with that. And I won't go through the whole litany of arguments about whether there is or not a challenge and what the impacts are. I think they're pretty clear to people who read the newspapers and think for themselves. So we haven't gotten around to real cooperation on this issue, at least not as governments. And people are worried about that. I do believe, however, that as peoples, we are beginning to do some things together, to do investments in alternative energy, to do investments in improved seeds and grain, to actually handle the problem. And if you look at the dynamic of the U.S.-China relationship, you see that it is really being driven by people. So I salute my friend Shen Dingli, who is one of the people that I've dealt with ever since 1995. People from his university and from yours, and I salute Bob Keatley, who is one of the kind of pioneers in the China watching business. We all went through the early days together. None of us ever had a clue that the relationship would reach the stage that it's at. So I leave you with those ideas, and I guess we have some time for questions.
Yes, I believe so. Thanks to our distinguished panel, and I'd like to open up the floor to continue our conversation, to take questions from the audience. Yes.
Bob Keatley said a fast to tell some Henry Kissinger stories.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
You said that if asked, you would tell some Henry Kissinger stories?
Oh, well, not a lot of gossip, but you can read that elsewhere. But I was going to say a little bit about traveling with Henry as a journalist, which I did a lot as secretary. The Secretary of State takes a small contingent of journalists with him or her on just about every trip. In my day, about a dozen. I think it's about the same now. As National Security Advisor, therefore not a member of the cabinet, Kissinger did not do that, nor did Brzezinski and others. But cabinet officers do. And I also traveled a little later with Cyrus Vance, a wonderful gentleman, when he was secretary. There'd be about a dozen of us, and at some point on every flight between Washington and the destination and coming home, or intermediate stops, we'd all troop up to the front of the plane and sit around a big conference table, 30 or 60 minutes, and he would try to spell out what he was up to, where we were going, why we were going, what are the main factors at work here, for better or worse, and what are we pointing toward, and what is the broad understanding of the other side's objectives and feelings. Not tactical information, not secret talks, and so forth. I think he treated us like a slightly retarded graduate students. One more lecture and I'll have them. But it was wonderful in that regard. You got briefed pretty well. You got some understanding. You could ask anything you wanted to, and it served his purpose. Obviously, we wouldn't be doing it otherwise. Much more, to the best of my knowledge, much more content than subsequent secretaries have offered to people who travel with them on a more consistent basis. However, he wasn't necessarily, I don't know if Nick ever had this experience, as gracious or kind to the people who worked for him. And I was rather put off by the way he treated some senior members of the State Department who were his immediate aides. He was quite demanding and not very considerate and rude, and would make unkind jokes sometimes for the benefit, I guess, of us who didn't really want those jokes. He also didn't communicate to State Department people not involved as fully as he perhaps did to us. I remember once flying to Moscow, and we were going for arms control talks, and he was spelling out things as I've just described. And his spokesman at the time was a wonderful man named George Vest, who I'm sure Nick knows. George was standing next to the table saying, "He never tells us that. He never tells us that. He never tells us that." And he quit that job in a few months and went on to be ambassador to the European Union, assistant secretary of state, and was a great man.
Let me maybe add a point here.
Sorry? I'm sorry.
Could I add a story of my own?
I have one more, and I'm done. It's very short. At another, because it does relate to you. Coming back from China once, he was talking about the contents of the trip and what we seemed to have accomplished and not done and whatever. And as usual, I took extensive notes and typed them out to save and refer to later. Well, I photocopied them and snuck a copy into the State Department and gave them to a friend on the China desk because they really wanted to know what the boss was saying, and apparently couldn't find out any other way. Nick.
There are hundreds, thousands maybe, Henry Kissinger stories.
Yes.
none of which, in the long run, are going to have any impact on his place in history, but are fun to talk about. He didn't keep the State Department informed properly until he became Secretary of State. But to work for, he was quite challenging. I only did that in very sporadic moments, and he asked me to write a toast once for the end of his first trip to China as Secretary of State. I was in Beijing at the time, and I worked hard on this toast, and we were getting time close to the deadline. Henry came in and ripped it out of my typewriter. And he looked at it and he said, "Platt, this is not your best work." And Winlord, who was sitting next to me, piped up, "That's an A minus." Anyway, there are plenty of examples of rudenesses and so on and so forth, but when you got into trouble, and I did, Henry Kissinger really helped to get me out. And it wasn't that he didn't have feelings for the worker bees. He did, and he really held things together for a long time during a period when the United States was floundering without leadership.
No, I'd certainly agree with that.
Okay, I guess this is a different question as far as the anecdotes are concerned. My question is actually this: it seems that it's part of the panel's consensus that to stimulate, global economic growth, the advice to China is to spend more. Whereas, don't you think that the Chinese reluctance to spend is the saving waste of the planet?
Before you answer that, I'd like to collect a few more questions, and then the panelists can respond.
Sure. When we were thinking about this series of events, a number of people asked if we could make sure that there would be some discussion of the Taiwan question. So I wanted to invite you to discuss that in the following fashion. I was very struck by the fact that, especially in Ambassador Platt's roundup of comments, what are the pressing issues, Taiwan was not there. And thinking of your theme of people-to-people diplomacy, you were generally talking about that in terms of U.S.-China. But if you think about a China-Taiwan situation, of course, Taiwan was the bit of creative ambiguity in the Shanghai Communiqué that was not specified so that commonalities could be celebrated, in a sense. In the intervening 40 years, there's been an enormous transformation in Taiwan, and in the last couple decades, an enormous transformation in relations between Taiwan and China, so that now you have over 1 million Taiwanese living in the Shanghai area. You have very close integration of business, flights back and forth. Did this not come up because you are seeing that this situation is being resolved by people-to-people diplomacy appropriately? Or do you have other thoughts about that relationship? That would be my question.
Mine's a bit more speculative. Considering the heavy crossover between the U.S. CDC and the Fortune 500 list, and considering the recent Citizens United decision, how do you see U.S. companies' involvement in China and Chinese stocking of U.S. capital affecting U.S. politics and U.S.-China relations in the coming years?
I didn't get that question. I'd like to. Would you just say it again?
Maybe you stand up.
Considering the crossover between the U.S. CDC and considering the crossover between the U.S. CDC and the Fortune 500 companies and general interest of companies in China, and the Citizens United recent decision in 2010, how do you see U.S. businesses' interest in China affecting U.S. politics and U.S. relations in the next years?
Okay.
Great questions.
Shall we? Are those your questions? Well, let me just take a crack at, and all you can chime in as you see fit. If we want the Chinese to spend more, and the U.S. to spend less, so hopefully we balance each other out, and it won't be a sort of a net giant consumption binge, which will impoverish the rest of the world, or actually it would enrich it. But in any case, it's not an either or situation. Brenna's question about Taiwan is a good one, and in fact, Taiwan cross-straits relations are as stable now as they have been for 20 years anyway, or longer than that, maybe ever since the Nixon visit. And the reason I think is that the Chinese are and the Taiwanese are taking a leaf out of the people-to-people book, and ever since Ma Ying-jeou came to power, the Chinese have been making concessions on direct flights, on trade, on tourism, and so forth. You have now 3 million mainlanders going to Taiwan every year. I mean, that's not without its problems, but it involves a conscious policy to integrate the economies and the societies of China and of the mainland and Taiwan. And the motto, of course, is economics first and politics later. Let's do the easy things now and hopefully get to the hard ones. So they're doing the economics now, and it's beginning to work. Whether and how soon that leads to the kind of political solution to the problem which is acceptable to the Taiwanese people and therefore to us, it remains to be seen. But this is a process that the U.S. very much welcomes. And the people in the mainland have seen this work between the U.S. and China, and now they're trying it out on themselves, and it's a very interesting thing to see. Your question about U.S. business relationships is a very good one. I think that U.S. business has always been, up until recently, the greatest booster of U.S.-China relations, and the desire to invest and trade and so forth is all originated with big companies and small companies and medium-sized companies in the private sector. There are issues now which are tarnishing that relationship at the edges. Intellectual property rights, theft of intellectual property and so forth are at front and center, and companies in America are very anxious that their trade secrets and their technology not be pirated, and it's been going on for a long, long time. And the Chinese industrial policy has been to require companies that want to have market share internally in China to basically make their technology available to the mainland, so that mainland companies can copy it and can make it theirs. This is going to be a problem for some years, but it's not going to last forever. If you look at the Taiwan example, where property rights, pirating, and so on and so forth were huge problems, the government became very responsive on this issue as soon as indigenous inventors and property developers developed property to lose. And this is happening in China very rapidly. There are more and more patents being taken out by Chinese. There are more and more Chinese that are getting really furious at their own people for, taking their stuff. So I think that the dynamic for a solution is there, but there is going to be some friction for years to come, and it's going to be one of the areas of discomfort in our relationship.
Well, a few words about the question on Taiwan. The U.S. position is to maintain status quo. That Taiwan need not to unnecessarily challenge the mainland by raising ideas that the mainland would feel uncomfortable. And mainland should seek a peaceful settlement with Taiwan. That's a U.S. position, and mainland for the moment has been accommodating the positive part of it, which is we work with the U.S. to make Taiwan not to challenge the current legal framework of Taiwan Strait relationship, that these are two parts of one China, and we should not change. But there is a difference between China and U.S. that we consider that we are entitled to settle the question on our term, peacefully or unreluctant, unpeaceful fashion. We are the owner of the two pieces of land which belong to China, so we should decide, not someone else to tell us what to do. But when we are weak, we would be strategically sensible not to hurt us by hurting others. And then the U.S. concern is that when you are strong, you would no longer be that sensible. You would challenge us. So this is a very subtle issue. So far, we have been able to stabilizing. But 2 years ago, when President Obama approved President George W. Bush's arms sale decision on January 28th, 2010, Chinese government made a harsh comment: "We're going to sanction the U.S." And this time it's real, indicating in the past that those were unreal. This time it's real, and this time it's still unreal. But we thought that we're entitled to sanction U.S. and we have the ability to impose. And by sanctioning the U.S., we would hurt ourselves. But this time we're willing to take the hurt, and we think we would hurt us less. But eventually we are sensible again by not hurting U.S. and hurting China, except for suspending the high-level military-to-military contact, which, in my view, is not a new sanction. We did this many times before. But I think with time passing by, China would feel more confident, more strong, and we want to do it on our term. And the U.S. would feel more and more uncomfortable, and U.S. cannot accept China to behave that way. So I would see there will be some unpredictable development in the future. But both countries want to handle their relationship on the question of Taiwan, not to, in a way, to destabilize the region. And they are too much independent already. And any harsh action on the others would unavoidably hurt the bilateral relationship. So I think they would have some rhetoric, harsh rhetoric, but they would still act in a sensible way.
Okay, on the spending, really it's shifting spending rather than increasing it more. Pour less concrete, make more things, grow more food that people want. China is a very inefficient user of water, energy, resources. A great deal could be done to improve the efficiency and not run us into the kind of consumption binge and stress on the world's resources that you may be suggesting. They could do much more price rationing, particularly on water. bring some of that efficiency into being. Same with energy. I believe the gasoline is still sold at much below world prices in China, and that's perhaps not a good economic position. Taiwan, I can speak from a position of ignorance. I don't have to pretend to speak for anyone. I think things have gone quite well in recent years. China, the mainland, Beijing should be quite happy with the improvements, but where it's going, I don't know. The basic problem to me is that some 22 million Taiwanese do not want to live under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, and they resist that. They don't be forced to do that. If and when we get some political changes on the mainland, I don't mean instant democracy, I don't see anything like that, but a country that has perhaps more transparency, more accountability, just more tolerance in political tolerance inside the country, less suspicious, less likely to see conspiracies when dissent or opposition is voiced. The Taiwanese may find the mainland a much more attractive place to be linked to somehow. China was hoping for some variation on the Hong Kong relationship, one country, two systems, the Taiwanese system much more generous and expansive than Hong Kong's. So far Taiwan is not interested, but I would just see someday there'll be some kind of a Chinese Commonwealth, and they may have a common flag and a common song, and life might go on more or less as it is, and the tension, sense of conflict might dissipate. As long as nothing happens by accident or design in the shorter term to create the kind of tensions that Professor Shen mentioned, that no one wants and would serve no one's purposes.
I think patience and biology are two factors which we have to bring into play. But John has been very patient so far, and I think that's good. And biology is inexorable. I know younger Taiwanese, one who said to me, we don't really care about all these symbols and flags and little the things that the older generation argues about. We want three things. We want, he's not speaking for all Taiwanese, but for his generation of Taiwanese entrepreneurs, I suppose. He says, we want an American education, a job in China, and a house in Taiwan.
And I say there are now some 2 million or more Taiwanese living and working on the mainland, about 10% of the population.
Well, I would like to thank our distinguished panel for a very interesting and rich discussion, and to invite you to join us for a reception right across the hall afterwards, and to remind you that there is more Mixing in China coming up this Friday. In addition to the opera, there's a panel on 40 years of U.S.